morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Hope you weren't caught in the snow. My name is Tosin, and I'm setting things up before handing you over to Jane. I know some of you are probably still waiting for the audio to connect, but if you can hear me, please drop me a note in the questions tab. That way we can make sure that your functions are working correctly. Excellent. So a couple of things to note before we begin. We will have some time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar, but please do log the questions as they occur to you. Handouts will be emailed to you at the end of the webinar. Should you have to leave early, as it does happen occasionally, please contact training@prca.org.uk. A member of the team will send you a copy after the webinar ends. You will receive an attendance certificate generated by GoToWebinar an hour after the room is shut. Please note that some email filters will send these to your junk or your spam folder, so just have a look in there. And then finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded. Don't worry, we won't be sharing any of your personal details during the webinar, except for your first name whenever you're responding to a question or a comment. Excellent, guys, that's me. I'm now handing you over to Jane. Enjoy this session and all the best.
Good morning, everybody. Let me just adjust my screen. I've got a big image of myself looking back at me, which I don't need at all. So good morning. Thank you, Tosin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And yeah, as Tosin says, I hope you haven't been too adversely affected by the weather. So here we are for 90 minutes webinar, the Diversity Dividend and the Power of Inclusion. Now, these webinars are brilliant toe-dipping introductions to particular topics. As Tosin says, we do have the chat box or the question function there. And this is such a rich topic, and one that lends itself very much to self-reflection and discussion. So although this is a webinar, I would love to encourage you to share your questions, your perspectives, your experiences in that box. You can send it privately or you can share with the group, and I will be calling on that throughout, so please do use that. As Tosin also says, that chat box is not going to be shared or recorded anywhere, it's just for the live purposes. So without further ado, my screen will wake up. There we go. So just briefly to introduce myself. So I guess you could say I have a portfolio career currently. I am 4 days a week, and I'm in the office now, a partner and head of people at fast-growing agency Hanbury Strategy. We focus on a combination of public affairs and corporate communications. And I mention that because I am probably in similar situations to many of you, running teams, dealing with clients, and so on. I, on the 5th day, support organisations like the PRCA with training, and I still do a little bit of consulting for other organisations within the comms industry and some corporates outside of this great industry equally. What sort of consulting do I do? It tends to be around leadership and culture, people management and inclusion. My background's quite a few years in comms now, agency side, most notably 15 years at Golin, so a global networked agency, part of the IPG group. And the first half of my career was doing corporate comms, so running teams, being frontline in terms of client campaigns. And then I have shifted over the last 13 years or so towards the HR and people side of things. I also sit on the board here at Hanbury. So again, I, just to give you a bit of insight, sort of responsible for setting and delivering a lot of these strategies around diversity and inclusion. There's a few accolades in terms of my diversity credentials on my LinkedIn. I won't go into that. And very recently, an ex-committee member of the brilliant organisation Women in PR, but still very much an active member on that front. So just a few brief introductions, so you know where my experience in this field comes from and who you're going to be spending a little bit of the morning with. Why are we here? So this is the bit where I would very much like to hear from you. I know broadly who I've got on the call, but I'm really interested in the motivations, why you've signed up for this course or been signed up for this course. What are the things you're looking to get out of this morning or perhaps refresh? So diversity and inclusion, I think, very simplistically, in the interest of time, I think we can look at the motivators here on two levels. One, and I will demonstrate this, there is a really, really strong business case, and I would hope that most of us in 2023 understand that more diversity within an organisation and supported by inclusion means that, especially in an industry where our people and our brains are our product, we only stand to gain if we have cognitive diversity, if we have representation, and if that's meaningful, if people are allowed to be themselves and unleash that for the full diversity of opinion and experience within our day-to-day work. There is, I would say, very strongly, and most importantly, a strong moral imperative to do this, to do the right thing and to make sure that we are representing the communities in which we are based and the communities that represent the audiences that our clients and stakeholders empower us to connect with. So again, I would encourage anybody who just feels like sharing a few words in terms of why you're here, and then that will help make sure that the following minutes are focused on delivering on those goals for you. So my favourite quote that crops up in many, many of my presentations. So I think it tells us what we know logically, that when we feel comfortable, when we're in a good place, when we're supported, when we're understood, we are more productive, obviously. We are better off. So on an individual basis, we just feel better, we enjoy our work, we engage with it more. But the reason I like this quote is that Sean Aker, who is a Harvard psychologist and quite a good person to follow, he puts a really big number to it. So this is not just a nice to have. This is not, oh, we're going to do a little bit better. 31% more productive when you are in a good place and when you are in a culture where you feel you belong. So there is a significant business driver to this content, excuse me. So very quickly, the content that we're going to cover this morning: inclusion versus diversity. Make sure that we understand the differences in these important kind of foundational concepts. I will throw some data points at you, but I am delighted that as this space has gathered pace over recent years, we're almost falling over data points to make the business case, if it still needs to be made within your organisations. We are going to then look on an individual basis at how our brains work, how our judgments and experiences layer, and the role of bias in this subject matter. And what we can do about that when we better understand ourselves and the inevitable judgments that we have, and perhaps slight blinkers. What is it that we can practically do to move ourselves along? Then we're going to zoom out a little bit, and look at more of a team level and an organisational level at some best practice. And I guess what I always talk about if I'm consulting or if I'm looking within my own organisation is, if we better understand the individual biases and experience, if we better understand the makeup of our current team, then we have the opportunity to wrap around some strategies and some policies to move us along and to help mitigate some of those inevitable blind spots. And then I'll just wrap things up, signposting a few further resources, and obviously, as Tosin said, give opportunities for any questions. I think the view that I've got here we go. I have got some comments coming in, but I just, the setup is, let me just see if I can increase that so I can see your comments a little more freely. Bear with me while I just read and talk. Thank you very much for those of you outlining your rationale and motivation for being here. Yeah, Wonderful. People making the point about as professional communicators being able to better serve communities and understand communities through the lens of diversity and inclusion, and whomever your audiences are, that clearly should be a real motivator. So thank you. So what does inclusion mean? Having a little look at some of these key terms before we move on. So there's possibly by now quite a well-known analogy and metaphor about inclusion and diversity and a party atmosphere. This party shown here, if we think about inclusion and whomever you are, whatever your profile is, I think we can all identify with this. Even back to, I always think about going back to school, and I am not very gifted on the sports field. And back in the day, and I am going back a little while, there were some quite archaic methods for choosing people for teams and sports team. And basically, I always felt excluded. I was most definitely the last person to be picked for most teams, and that had a really lasting effect on me. And I'm sure if we all navel gaze, we will find an aspect, or maybe many aspects of our lives, where we have felt that, we have felt othered. So it may be that we're at a party and that the music is pumping, that we are having to squeeze through a crowded room such as this, and we don't know anybody, and nobody is making eye contact with us, nobody is offering us a drink or a slightly crusty canapé, and nobody is asking us to dance effectively. It's that sort of scenario and that sort of mindset, and things that might feel very micro on an individual level in the workplace. If there are equivalent scenarios that happen day in, day out, it could be perhaps in 2023, something around our working patterns. If there are people that are in the office a lot and there are people that are remote working, there is a danger without deliberate and active intervention to mitigate this. There is a danger that there could be a bit of a them and us. So that's what inclusion, or conversely exclusion, might feel like. And here comes this pretty well-known quote, but it does really drive this home. Diversity is being invited to a party. Showing up, that's a tick box. Inclusion is actually being asked to dance. So very often, programs, organizational programs that have got a lot of attention or maybe moved forward in recent years might just be about getting diversity in the door. But far more important, one would argue, and the other half of the equation to really get the outcomes we're looking for, is that people are understood, and inclusion, cultural inclusion, is widespread. And we can't really get to land this on this important platform unless we have the two here. And we're going to explore this a little bit further. So, an inclusive culture, not necessarily straightforward. It takes deliberate and sustained focus, but it allows people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of characteristics, all sorts of ways of thinking, that's the cognitive diversity, to work effectively together, to embrace, to harness, to use those differences effectively, and to allow everybody collectively to achieve their highest potential. Diversity, however, tends to be about focusing on the numbers, on the profile, on the data. It is the two of them together that can really unleash the potential and the power. And it is entirely possible, I wouldn't say common, that would be probably pessimistic, to have diversity and not necessarily inclusion. So just to drive the point home, I won't read all of these out, you're perfectly capable of doing that yourself. But some of the key differences, it could be the visible and invisible. We might make assumptions just based on somebody's physical characteristics about their experiences, their background, and the cognitive diversity. It does include the freedom to be yourself, is very much around inclusion, and it's being asked to dance. Yeah. behavior leading to culture. So it's, I think I have a quote later on from Harvard Business Review. It's the micro behaviors, it's the micro conversations every day that lead to the sum of the parts, which is culture. Keeping an eye on the chat box to see if there's any questions or comments coming in as we go. I thought it was useful to just briefly reflect on the impact of COVID and the pandemic. Although we are very much in a post-COVID, post-pandemic, or certainly post-lockdown environment, there are long-tail impacts, obviously. And in terms of diversity and inclusion, this is UK specifically, around 9% of the workforce lost jobs after being furloughed. There was an overrepresentation of underrepresented groups, and there's a couple of data points there about young people very much at the beginning of the workforce, and workers from non-white communities. So 22% over the overall population of 9%. We can see that's really, really skewed. I don't think I've got too many data points here specifically, but we also know, thinking about International Women's Day yesterday, that women and working parents were overrepresented in terms of those that temporarily left the workforce, and potentially we're in danger of losing that talent pool, and therefore further kind of impacting the shape of the workforce in a post-COVID world. My screen has gone to sleep. Okay, slightly grainy graphic here, but again, I could fill an hour and a half, I could probably fill a week and a half with data points looking at either different types of diversity specifically, sort of individual axes of diversity, or overall more diverse, more inclusive organisations. We know categorically that organisations perform better, and we can break it down in terms of diversity at board level and leadership level, or across the entire organisation. More data points here. Yeah, interestingly, there's a lot of research that suggests staff retention, which has been top of mind in recent months and years, is greatly improved by diversity. Having that cohesive teams where people feel that anything goes and everybody can be themselves. What else? Yeah, the final point there, and this is, admittedly, I haven't looked back to see whether Legal & General have actually delivered on this promise, but we are starting to see quite publicly made commitments and targets to greater diversity. And we could have a whole separate debate around the merits and pitfalls of setting quotas, but doing so publicly certainly does drive change, or consequences if one doesn't quite make it. So in just a couple of minutes, hopefully I've opened your eyes to and kind of shared just a small cross section of the many data points out there to back up a business case for diversity and inclusion. Also, signpost, I'm sure many of you are aware, but the PRCA census is live and in the field at the moment, and there are always some great data points to look at the shape and profile of our industry, and whether we are moving forwards comprehensively, or whether there might be pockets of resistant challenge and change in terms of the profile of the workforce and the diversity within. So that will be a good one to have a look at in the coming weeks when the results are announced. Yeah, this was interesting. This is a couple of years old, this data point, and I think it came from Boston Consulting Group, if memory serves. It looked at a number of developed countries, so it's not just UK, a lot of Western organisations, the corporate universe in the West, essentially. And on the plus side, I'm just gonna, where's my cursor gone? There it is. I'm just gonna rearrange my screen slightly. Yeah, on the plus side, the vast majority of corporates in the West now have well-established diversity and inclusion programs. It is somewhere, at least, on the corporate agenda. That is a positive. However, at the moment, there is a persistent, I should say, disconnect between the money and the programs and the impact. So just a quarter of those groups, those employees who are identified within those programs, really feel material benefit. And that is a lot of dollars, that is a lot of money, not quite hitting the mark currently. Now, massively oversimplifying a global trends and data set, what is driving that disconnect, and what can we learn in our own organizations? Well, essentially that there is incongruence between the leadership or whomever is driving and designing these programs and their actual target audiences. And I often refer to ivory towerism, where those in leadership positions might think they know best, but my goodness, a powerful lesson is to listen, really listen, don't make assumptions, and then act based on the insights that you gather, and continue to do that. Not listen once and then close the door. Involve the targeted groups in your programs on an ongoing basis. Okay. So a quick look at the legal framework, the legal landscape in this country. And if we have anybody who looks after other jurisdictions or maybe works with colleagues in other markets, this is fairly representative, certainly in Europe, of the employment landscape. So the UK legislation, most notably in this space, was back in 2010, the Equality Act, and it identified 8 key characteristics, protected characteristics, which employers are required to pay attention to. So age, disability, and disability might encompass emotional and mental disability as well as physical. That's an important distinction to make. Gender reassignment and related platforms have had an awful lot of excuse me, an awful lot of airtime in recent months. Your marital or civil partnership status, pregnancy and maternity, also something that continues to take up quite a lot of time and space. Your race or ethnicity, religion or value system, and sex or gender. So that is the core framework, and those of us who might have a responsibility in an organisation for the HR function and making sure that the way we do business is the right side of the law, this is really, really important. Every time I move something on my screen, it freezes. There we go. So just building on that to more of a sort of softer context, it is incredibly complex what might sit over and above or around those 8 protected characteristics, and where we as fallible humans might start to make some judgments based on our experiences. The subtle things that intersectionality is a little bit of a buzzword bingo in this space. But of course, none of us are any one thing. We are all a brilliantly rich, diverse melting pot of experiences, and our profiles, we don't sit neatly in boxes, and nor should we. It's wonderful, rich diversity that we should understand and appreciate. But we could be making judgments, either deliberate or unconscious, around somebody's age. That crops up a lot in recruitment, especially if we are talking about really young, vibrant agencies, for example. We could even, if we're, you know, if our place of work is somewhere that people might drive to, you know, walking through the car park, we might make judgments based on the cars that people drive, their politics, where they were educated, even exercise and sports tribes, you know. Are you a Peloton user? We might then also make judgments about your you know, your earning power and earning potential. Are you a cat person, a dog person? I'm getting slightly facetious, but you get kind of where I'm going, that we can layer all of this and make really, really quick judgments potentially about people. So I said we'd have a little look at kind of on a one-to-one level, increase awareness and be more conscious and thoughtful about the lens through which we view ourselves and those around us, those that we work with. So, unconscious bias, I'm just going to move my screen again a little bit. There we go. So, what is bias? Make sure again that we've got a common understanding of some of these really important concepts. Bias is a judgment made consciously, even with compelling data and information to the contrary. It will absolutely be wrapped up in the lives that we've led, the paths that have pointed us in the direction that we're in today. So cultural stereotypes, where you've lived, the people with which you've interacted that have helped form some of those values and belief systems. It is a part of the human condition. As I say, we are fallible, and we'll have a very brief look at some neurology in a slide or two's time, just to land that message. Unconscious bias specifically is a very, very quick, almost instantaneous judgment that we might make based on the limited facts and our own life experiences. And you know, hands up, I am absolutely subject to unconscious bias. There is no perfect individual. There is no shining example of a bias-free individual. It affects us all. One example that sticks out in recent times was a conference that I was at, and I think it might have been International Women's Day last year, actually. It was a conference looking at gender and women in leadership, and there was a panel of, I think it's 3 or 4 women and just 1 man. And I made instantaneous judgment about the male panelist based on what he was wearing, his age, and his job title. And at least I was conscious. I made the instant judgment, and then as the panel progressed, I became quite conscious of that rash judgment. And thankfully, my mind was open enough for that original unconscious bias and immediate judgment to be overturned. But it happens all the time. I probably did it about 14 times on my commute in this morning, just looking at the people around me too. And yeah, the point here quite clearly in the workplace is that will give people around us unearned advantage and potentially disadvantage, and that clearly is the driver behind us trying to understand our biases and then figure out what we can do to mitigate them. So this is just one slide, but oh my goodness, there is so much data out there if you really want to get under the skin of this. We know just how much we are exposed to in today's society, the data points, the speed with which we access information, and kind of, you know, the technology revolution, the speed with which we live and work. Our brains have to have some survival mechanisms, and essentially from a neurological perspective, they look at kind of common pathways, established truths, things that they can cling to cut out that noise and focus on the important stuff. It could be, for example, that you know subconsciously that you don't step out on a tube line, or that you stop at the side of the road, or that when you are pouring the kettle in the morning, you need to pay attention so that you don't burn yourself. That I'm being facetious, but in terms that the same mindset that keeps us able to function and not overthink and engage with every single one of those 11 million data points might also contribute to unconscious thinking, unconscious bias in terms of how we interact with those that we work with. So just to bring this to life a little bit, and I am quite sure you have plenty of anecdotes here, and I would love to hear them and share in the question box if you do. A few years ago now, YouTube launched a video upload feature, but 5 to 10% shortly after launch of the videos they noticed were upside down, and that's a pretty decent margin if we're looking at kind of, you know, tech launches. That's not a great margin for error. It was because the engineers had entirely designed the product for right-handed people, and as a left-handed person, I frequently find similar things actually with perhaps things that I'm sent, or people that use my phone things are oriented the wrong way, in inverted commas, for me. That is relatively simple. You know, that I can't remember what the percentage of the workforce, we're a decent percentage of your audience to have excluded in that whole development process. I imagine a few of you might have come across Invisible Women by this lady, Caroline Criado Perez, a few years old now, but it is fascinating to read, even in, this millennia, just how much of product design has excluded women to really quite serious consequences, like astronauts and their equipment, or even seatbelts and safety functions in cars not being designed for the female physique. Move on down, that is a grainy picture, although I'm quite pleased personally that it's grainy, of Mr. Trump there. But there's a hyperlink here, and I know it's a few years old, but it really is a fascinating case study. Maybe some of you know it already, about Heidi and Howard. And essentially, it was in a university, a US university setting, and I think it was business students were asked to appraise a sort of leadership case study. The context, the case study was exactly the same, but the names were swapped out for Heidi and Howard. And the reaction and the responses, the analysis from the educated audience was dramatically different. And there were conclusions drawn, which we can only assume were based on gender expectations and what people thought was appropriate of a male leader versus a female leader. There are many, many other similar examples. I think it was the New York Symphony Orchestra, again, quite infamous in inclusion circles, where they were auditioning for new members of the orchestra. And simply based on the fact that even when it was blind, but people could hear the candidates coming in and out, that there were less favourable responses to essentially the same audition when the judges could hear high heels and therefore a female candidate clip-clopping to and from the audition. So bias is alive and well. Just a little task that I'd love all of you to spend a moment doing. It's not going to be the most empirically sound, but just to start the grey matter going. If we think about the our circle of influence, the people that we engage with on a regular basis, and therefore could be feeding unconsciously probably our judgments and our life experiences. If we have a little look at our phone, you know, maybe choose the app that you use most frequently, whether you want to dip into email or you want to look at WhatsApp or whatever your platform of choice is. If you look at the 5 people that you have been in contact with most recently or most frequently, maybe you extend that to think about the 10 people, the 15 people. Think about what these people are like. How similar are they to you? Are they all family members? Are they your closest work colleagues? Are they, you know, members of your household, and so on and so forth? Quite obviously, especially as educated communicators, you'll also be very, very familiar with, you know, social algorithms and echo chambers and so on, and the role that technology might play to filter in or filter out those of similar opinions. Of course, this does have really big moments during things like elections, and certainly during the Brexit campaign a few years ago. Now, I'm not suggesting that we discommunicate everybody in our social circle or workforce in that, you know, for the same reasons. But what I am saying is just heightening that awareness of the circles of influence and those that may inform and educate and reinforce, therefore confirmation bias, the opinions that we have. Just a little kind of light bulb moment, I guess. So what can we do about it? Let's try and get practical. And I'm just going to keep checking the chat box to see if, as I say, I'd really, really welcome your observations. And if you've got any kind of life hacks and tips about how to effectively mitigate some of these inevitable biases, I'd love to hear from you. So self-awareness is super, super key. It's the starting point. We can only really fix or address what we're aware of and what we have the courage to identify and acknowledge. So what do you think your personal blind spots are? Were there any sort of, thoughts sparked from thinking about who's in your circle of influence and who's in your closest communities at work or socially? If you look at the makeup of your organizations and teams, are there areas that are really, really unknown to you that you might be able to proactively engage with to better understand? Maybe, yes, I have put this in here, thinking very currently during Ramadan, do you really understand what Ramadan means to the Muslim community and what it might mean in terms of working patterns and how you as a colleague or a friend might be able to support and engage more effectively? There is an implicit bias test there, which comes from Harvard, and that is a hyperlink. It is a free kind of, how often do you do this? Are you aware of? Along the different axes, characteristics of the protected characteristics that might help you identify some of the potential blind spots. Yeah, that first one, alcohol-based socializing. So this might also be precipitated slightly on how international an organisation you are, the different types of communities or religions or ages in your teams. But I think historically, we're probably all can associate British culture and British working culture with a relatively alcohol-fueled kind of setup. It is something that we have noticed here at Hanbury a lot in recent years and months with feedback, is that we don't, that certainly the younger members of the team don't want everything to be precipitated on alcohol. It may be that religion, personal choice or circumstance, we could have, for medical reasons, that we could have pregnant team members to make sure that we are thinking laterally and including rather than excluding. Yeah, and that last point, I think we'll come back to a few times in the remainder of this content and may not be new to you, but there is opportunity, there is risk of putting one's foot in mouth in areas that we are less familiar with. And I think, in the workplace and possibly in quite litigious environments, there is, and maybe very, kind of high profile or senior people could feel quite hamstrung by, I don't want to put myself out there, or how do I communicate with a team member that's told me that they're gay or that they're expecting a child, and kind of how do I have those conversations about maternity leave, for example. I always say, if you come at these conversations, even with gaps in your knowledge, if the intent is quite clear and if you are respectful, that is a very, very good place to start from. And one would hope that the audience can be a little forgiving and understand your perspective. Waking up the screen again. So, allyship, I think, is a really important concept here if we are thinking about how can we, what can we do practically and at an individual level. So allyship, I think, sits alongside the concept of privilege, and privilege is when somebody has a position of power. Essentially, if you are in a minority along any of those protected characteristics, any of those diversity axes, then you will have some form of privilege. And therefore, in order for us to make progress at anything other than a glacial rate, the majority is, there's a responsibility on the majority to support and advocate for the underrepresented groups. Allies do certainly hold great power. If you, as I say there, if you are not engaging actively, then you are actually allowing the status quo to persist. But I recognise that this can take courage. Let's get a bit more specific and practical here. So, Where's my copy? There it is. I want to make sure that we cover some really important concepts without overdoing kind of the buzzwords and so on. But as we've just introduced the concept of allyship and the importance and the power that the majority have to support those who are still underrepresented and on a journey, what do we mean by performative? It's essentially the tick box. It's I've had a session, we've had an hour's training session, therefore the box is ticked and I can go away and polish my halo and feel quite comfortable. No, it has to be everyday action. It has to be chipping away at some of those day-to-day behaviours to shift the culture overall. And it's going to be sustained, and it probably involves a little bit of discomfort and education, and it's a bit of a cliche, but doing the work, as is often referred to. And continuing to listen and understand. So true empathy is not doing unto others as you would wish to be done unto you. It's actually listening, understanding, learning, and walking in their shoes, supporting them in a way that is meaningful to them. I still, again, I'm kind of awash with data points from International Women's Day yesterday, but there is still a lot that suggests in work and the workplace and in society at large that women are not listened to and are talked over more in meetings and in dialogues. So we can very subtly, if you are in a privileged position, if you are a male, you might be able to help through allyship and just re-interrupt and say, oh, I'm not sure that Jane had finished what she was saying, or I think the point that was made earlier was a really interesting one. Can you revisit or expand? That subtle sort of intervention is positive allyship. It is not patronising. What else have we got here? Yeah, again, to make sure that we are avoiding performative interventions and tick box exercises, we are looking at your words and your commitment actually being followed up with action, the day-to-day action that drips to change behaviours and culture. Yeah, banter is a really interesting one, and again, something that we could fill hours with. It's subtle. It's really, really subtle. And it's often what the minority kind of fall back on and say, oh, but it's just a joke. It's not a joke if the minority feel othered and if they find it offensive. So if you are in a scenario, in a situation where you can see that the banter is has crossed a line and may be offensive to somebody in the minority, you have a real responsibility to appropriately interrupt that. Now, whether you choose to do it live or whether you think the outcome will be more effective by taking it offline, I will leave that judgment call to you. My counsel is always to think about it to be outcome focused. Am I going to antagonize and inflame, or am I going to be talking to somebody in a way that they're actually ready to listen to me and take on board that feedback and change their behaviour? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I think I'd trailed this phrase a little bit earlier. Doing anything once or turning up and listening passively is not going to lead us to a sustained inclusive culture. And changing culture is a big thing. It's kind of turning a juggernaut. I won't underestimate or paint this through rose-tinted glasses. But doing anything once won't change the corporate culture. It's reinforcing that day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month. That's what we're talking about. And that very much talks to the concept of allyship. Okay. So what about at an organisational level? We've spent a little bit of time there just thinking on a one-to-one basis, understanding our own biases and frameworks, and thinking practically what we might be able to do based on that level of self-awareness. Let's think a little bit about organisational approaches. So we made the distinction at the outset between diversity and inclusion. and I suggested that diversity is precipitated a lot on data, on numerics, on profile and box ticking. It's not to say it is not a fundamental and important starting point. So many organisations do this. We certainly do it once a year, and I don't suggest it's a revolutionary or a new approach, but an equal opportunities survey. And those of you, just looking at sorts of organisations represented, I am quite sure many of you are all over this. But understanding the existing profile of your team and or your target audiences, your constituencies, your communities, is such an important starting point. It's a bit like, to use a medical analogy, you are trying to fix the wrong problem. You've got a broken leg and you're trying to fix a headache. Understanding your starting point is really, really powerful. So through that, knowing where your starting point is, you can then identify what your goal is. So if, for argument's sake, and I will candidly talk about our organisation, our gender profile isn't too bad. Our ethnicity profile is pretty decent and improving at quite a decent pace. Disability, we've probably got a way to go. Sexuality is also pretty in decent shape, but probably for us, the area of biggest opportunity is social mobility and economic background. So that is something in our strategy and in our stated KPIs and goals that we are really, really focusing on moving. Setting public goals, so that the phrase about what gets measured gets managed. If it gets measured and if it gets publicly shared, and this might fall to things like gender pay gap, if you're above 200 and you have to publicly announce that, or if you're under 200 and you choose to share some of these data points, that is probably driving accountability and can be a very, very powerful change maker. The tone of humility, yes, I'm going to give you an example of a few years ago now when I was purely consulting around inclusion, and it was in the early days of gender pay gap reporting. And I had two clients that I was working with, neither of them in this sector, I should make clear. One of the clients was a big utility, and they had been working with me over a 12-month period. They had collected data from the previous year when they didn't actually need to report, but they were already ahead of the curve. They were understanding their organisation, where they were and where they were going. And they had the humility, as the word I've got on the slide there, to communicate internally, and the internal audience should be the priority, the first priority, that they had a long way to go. They were quite an engineering oriented organisation. They had quite a skew towards an older workforce, and on their gender specifically, they had a long way to go. So by the time that they were reporting in the April or the May, whenever they disclosed, the internal audiences already knew that they had quite a long way to go, and they knew what programs were in place, and they were regularly throughout the year checking in and reporting back on progress. To contrast that, and I remember it very clearly because I had a holiday right around the reporting deadline, I had another client that got in touch about the week before and said, oh, the HR team were dealing with this, and we saw the draft report. It came to the ExCo, the board, this week, and it's horrific, it's horrendous. What do we do? Well, there's very little one can do in a matter of days or hours, and clearly the takeout was, this is an always-on endeavour. It is not a question of gender pay gap washing on one day a year. So there was a powerful lesson in that, I think. Yeah, in terms of more organisational approaches, what can we do? We really need to understand where the biggest challenge or barriers might be to to diversity on one particular protected characteristic or overall to inclusion. It's back to that data point. Understand your current employee experience, understand what it might look like from the outside in. So if you are a potential new hire, for example, what might be the barriers even to engaging with that organisation, and what can you do therefore to set those goals and the strategies, the policies, the structures to move you closer to the desired outcome. Yes. The other thing I personally feel quite strongly about is that the best approach to achieving lasting change in this space is a kind of holy trinity, essentially, that the HR function and team, and if you have a really small organisation, if you're a small agency, the HR may also be, aligned to the leadership. But the HR function is responsible for a lot of the processes that will drive improvement. So making sure you're legal in terms of the protected characteristics, gathering the data, perhaps if you have an equal opportunity survey, making sure there are fair recruitment processes or promotion processes and so on. So HR absolutely has to be a part of that holy trinity, but DE&I should not be seen as the HR team's responsibility or something that the HR team does to everybody else. The leadership team needs to be absolutely involved in this process. They need full buy-in and they need to be leading the way. Otherwise, the credibility is totally shot. And the third part of that holy trinity, I would suggest, is the team. That unless there is buy-in from the masses, unless they feel that they are engaged in the solutions, then you're never really going to get past go. So, as I say, I would suggest it needs to be a combined effort from those three really, really important constituencies. And in my experience, that's when you see the most effective change. Yeah, I think I've made this point a few times already, but I'm going to make it again. This is a long-term thing. Organisations, especially in our sector, are changing really, really fast. So you can't kind of get this right once and then leave it alone. One needs to continue to feed, to learn, and to change according to the zeitgeist. And it will take time if it is a question of changing culture. That is a long-term endeavour, and it's not necessarily easy, but it's necessary, and the prize is significant and important. But I know this stuff is hard, and I know that we all have day jobs, and you know, in climates such as now, there's a lot of challenge facing individuals and those that are running businesses. So don't try and reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of support and expert third parties who can help you accelerate progress here. There is a slide coming up with further resources, but organisations that I would signpost you to include BME PR Pros and their blueprint. It is a very rigorous certification program and framework for inclusion excellence. It is specifically focused on ethnicity, but it is far broader than that, and is really, really rigorous and a great point to look at. It could be your North Star. It may be that it will take quite a lot of work to get there, but at least you can understand some of the best practice that you might try and aim towards. Creative Equals is an organisation, similar organisation. They offer all sorts in terms of training, consulting, guidance, and I believe a similar sort of certification or framework to Blueprint. Their background is very much on the creative end of the marketing spectrum, but they are excellent, and organisations like Ketchum, I know, have worked extensively with them and actually with Blueprint, to be fair. The Inside Out Charter, and full disclosure, my very good friend Rob Stevenson is really, really active in the mental health and well-being space. Creative Equals are so good, I've put them on there twice. And No Turning Back used to be called BAME 2020, but also a really, really powerful ally and partner in this space. The final point here, and if I had more time, I would go into a bit more detail. If you are a manager or in a even more senior position, if you would consider yourself a leader, how can I manage a team? How can I manage people? How can I behave day to day in an inclusive way? If you Google the Deloitte model of inclusive leadership, you will see a great framework that looks at 6 key behaviours, leadership behaviours. Now, I would suggest as a leadership coach and consultant that actually that is just a good model for leadership in 2023. It doesn't need to be treated separately. How can I be an inclusive leader? How can I be an effective leader? The two things are part and parcel. So I would signpost you to that to have a look at. We are getting towards the end of the content, and I'm just going to check the chat box again. Please do be thinking about any questions or experiences, anecdotes that you might want to share as we kind of draw things to a conclusion. We do have plenty of time for Q&A. So I quite often get asked, especially at kind of at corporate level, well, who's doing this really, really well? And it's complex, right? And some of you may have seen some data, I think it was Harvard Business Review in recent weeks, that paints a little bit of a negative picture that maybe in the immediate aftermath of Black Lives Matter a few years ago, when this subject matter was again propelled to the top of the agenda and the news agenda, there was a lot more investment in these sorts of frameworks. There was a boon in chief diversity officers within big corporates, for example. And one might suggest that the data points more recently are that those key hires are struggling to achieve lasting change, and or maybe individuals are moving on because they don't feel like they've got the teeth, the budget and so on to really actually be able to deliver on that change. That could be a little challenging to those of us really trying to push change forward, but there is always hope. What I tend to find, rather than finding lots of examples of organisations doing it brilliantly across the whole spectrum, there tend to be maybe examples of organisations doing parts of it really, really well that we might be able to learn from. Jamba Juice is one that you can look up. It's not a UK example, granted, but it's where somebody properly embraced inclusion. So yes, the diversity work was done as well, but it was utterly embedded in the culture in a brave, meaningful way that the leadership level was transformed to be vastly more representative, and lo and behold, my goodness, did the company's performance turn round. So a very powerful link between kind of all inclusive inclusion, as bad English, and a significant turnaround in the company's performance. So that's just one example. Within our industry, I would say the PRCA are very good at championing forms of excellence here. So across all of the awards, you can see in recent years many more diversity oriented accolades to help give you an idea either of specific kind of areas or programs, or organisations that are really smashing it across the piece. And I've already name dropped Ketchum being one of them. Wake up screen. So yes, just to signpost a few examples here. There are lots of people that you might want to follow. I post quite a mixture of stuff on LinkedIn, but a fair chunk of inclusion and diversity related content. On here, the REEB boards, now a year or two old, but the Race and Ethnicity Equity Board from the PRCA, and they have a diversity specific Twitter handle, which is a really good follow. Karen Blackett, very high profile, does a lot of government work as well, kind of advisory. That was just a nice kind of bite-sized top 10 tips to get on top of this space. publications like Management Today, Harvard Business Review. If you don't have access to a subscription, you tend to be able to get a little bit of free content on a monthly basis. We've got BME PR Pros there, Creative Equals, Women in PR. I'm slightly biased, awesome organisation, and Taylor Bennett actually, also brilliant movement in this sector. So before my voice runs out, just I guess to leave you with some clarity from the brilliant William Sloane Coffin. This isn't easy, and diversity may be the hardest thing for a society to live with. It's uncomfortable. We just have to look at the news on a daily basis to know just how challenging this is. But it is perhaps the most dangerous thing for a society to be without. And what goes for a society certainly translates to the organisations and the teams within which we work. So that brings us with a lot of time actually to the end of the content. I would love to hear from you. I'm having slight issues expanding my screen so I can really easily see the questions and comments. But yeah, I would love to hear how the session has gone in terms of responding to any goals and objectives that you have, but also to hear any remaining questions or contributions, because I am quite sure you have plenty of really valuable contributions to make as an audience. Thank you for your ears. I'm going to have some water, but I'm glad my voice held up. Sometimes I get so impassioned, I speak too loudly and then the voice suffers. Anybody out there? I know you're alive because I have some communications from earlier in the session. I will make sure that Tosin and the PRCA get these updated slides immediately after this, so they will be in your inbox very soon. And please do contact me. You can find me via LinkedIn afterwards, or I'm sure Tosin would direct you to me via email if you prefer. But I'd be really happy to follow up on anything in more detail if it particularly piques an interest. I don't think we've got anything coming in the question box. Tosin, please jump in if I've missed something, but I think there's a thank you up there. Great, there is some content coming in there. Good, seems like it was useful. The combination of an individual perspective and kind of a team and company level, awesome. It's great to hear feedback. I would like to hear feedback, good and bad, so we can make sure that this content is relevant, of course, to the audience. So thank you very much for that feedback. I will leave this open just a little bit longer, but thank you very much for your participation and attention. Feel free to drop off, or as I say, I'll keep an eye out for any questions for the next minute or so. All right, I think that's me over and out.